Yeah, so we were going to talk about how ancient Ireland
Yeah,
was both capitalist and socialist, and also it was neither. So take it away, Kev. Tell us how ancient
yeah.
Ireland was both
Well,
and
we
neither.
we were chatting about this off air, I guess. Um, but it's an idea that I've had for a while to put something together, like an article or a video. Yay! Um, uh, because like I've given talks about Ireland many times, and I like to use this hook of ancient Irish anarchy because it raises eyebrows. It gets people kind of curious about it, and there's a lot of aspects of it that we would consider maybe libertarian or individualist in some ways. I actually did an interview with Paul Meany just last week about how Ireland was a stateless society, and I guess depending on how you approach the Brehon Law in early Ireland, you can kind of see what you want to see in it. If you're coming at it from a lefty point of view, you'll see socialist principles, and if you're coming at it as a libertarian, you're going to see like more anarchic ideas in there. And it kind of the idea for this article came up not so long ago on the Brehon Law, the Brehon Academy page. You remember years ago, you and I met up in Trinity College, and you had your camera there, and you
Yeah,
recorded a little video of me, and it was the three principles of Brehon Law that can help change society. And the first one
yeah,
was judicial market opening, like a competition of judges, a competition for justice. And the second one was well, one of them was restorative justice. Oh yeah, and the other one was having an honor price, that the higher your rank in society, the higher standard you were held to. And somebody underneath this video was like, you sound like an Ayn Rand disciple. And I was like, what? It just like took me back. Like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? I'm just trying to explain these things as they were. You can like imply that I'm something or not. That's not the point. The point is like this is how they did things. And it went back and forth a little bit, and it ended, which was like, I'm a socialist and I think that the tribal law was socialist. I was like, well, that's not how history works. But it gave me the idea that it would be really interesting to have a conversation about what was it. And the reason why I say it was neither and both, because it was neither in the sense that these words didn't exist to them, and
yeah.
they didn't aspire to be, we want to be capitalist or we want to have a socialist order. They didn't aspire to either of those things. Like, if anything, they aspired to be like the fundamental principles, or the bedrock of society was around the family, and from the justice and the order of the family, everything was expanded upon. So in the same sense that in your family you do want to look after each other and you take care of each other, and your parents pay for your school uniform and your books and all of this, and in a sense that's a redistribution of wealth of your parents, right?
Yeah, it's centralized, yeah.
Yeah, it's centralized, but there is a hierarchy and there's an authority structure there.
Hmm.
And when your parents are taking care of you, they're redistributing their wealth to you, right? And if
Yeah,
somebody in your family needs to like have some treatment done, or they get a hole in their jeans, they need to get some of that money to replace the hole in their jeans, right? So in the very like in the bedrock of society, you can say there's a lot of socialistic elements there in the family. And that was true in early Ireland. But you just extrapolate that out further, because the concept of the family, first of all, wasn't nuclear as we had. Obviously, they had a nuclear family, like mommy, daddy, brothers, and sisters, of course. But the
sure.
nuclear, it went up to the two, exactly. But the nuclear family was, in their mind, actually to the grandfather, first grandfather. So that was the Derefina, Gelfina, Irfina. That was the Derefina. My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. I have to stop the stream here. It was a pre-recorded conversation, so it allowed me to go back afterwards and make a small correction. I wasn't using any notes for this conversation. It was kind of stream of consciousness, and I mixed up the Gelfina and the Derefina. So I started with the Derefina. That was incorrect. What I should have started was the Gelfina. So the Gelfina were all of the kinsmen who descended from a common grandfather. And in a sense, this could be considered the nuclear Irish family in comparison to the nuclear family that we have today. It wasn't just considered like the parents and the children, it went all the way to a common grandfather. So I must say that this was always in the patrilineal line of descent, so it's related to the father and the father's father. If we were to start from the bottom row here, this bottom row would be the current generation, so this would be you. And then it's your relationship to your father and his siblings, and then their relationship to their father, which would be your grandfather. Now, the next line in descent was the dearifine. And this was the true kin for the purposes of law. So whenever the Brehons were treating the family as a family unit, it went up to the dearifine, which are all of the kinsmen who share a common great grandfather. So your grandfather's father. There's a lot of fathers in this. So if this was you, and then this is your relationship to your father and his siblings, and then to your father's father, which was the grandfather and his siblings, and then that they all shared a common line of descent from a single great grandfather. And then finally, we had what was called the iarfine, which meant the afterkin. This wasn't really important for the purposes of the law, but it's interesting to just understand how the early Irish thought of themselves within the Fine, how they viewed their family unit. And it was all the kinsmen who shared a common great-great-grandfather. Now, I know I said this is a patrilineal line of descent. That's just the nature of the way the law was back then. This did not ignore that the matrilineal line of descent was also very important. Especially in regards to the education and the rearing of the child. The female line had a high importance as well, but for the purposes of law, it was a patrilineal line of descent. So, just to recap on that, the first unit was the gelfine, not the dearifine, as I said mistakenly. So the first unit was the gelfine, or your bright kin. The second unit was the dearifine, or the true kin. And the third unit was the iarfine, or the afterkin. And for the purposes of the Brehon Law, it was the dearifine that was given the most importance. So I just wanted to make that small correction, and we can jump back over into the stream now and continue the conversation, just bearing in mind that when I'm talking of the dearifine here, what I should have been talking about first is the gelfine. I mixed these two up, so just keep that in mind as we go forward. So the dearifine was the grandfather, all of his kids, and all of their kids was a unit called the dearifine, which means the true kin. And then the next step of the family, which they also thought of as their family, was the gelfine, which was the great-grandfather, all of his children and cousins and uncles and brothers and sisters and all of this, and all of their kids and all of their kids. And that was a unit in society. And then the next one was called the iarfine, which was the great-great-grandfather, right? Even all of their brothers and sisters as well, right? They're still part of the clan because they're the brother of the great-great-grandfather. Did I say great-great? Yeah. All his brothers and sisters and all their children, and then his children and their children, and then all the way down to you, which was the current generation. So their concept of what the family was huge, really. Like, it was a big number of people that were kind of dispersed within a relatively close geographical area. So the idea of the community in that sense then was obviously intimately tied to the family. And we were talking earlier as well that an interesting way to think about these families was not just tied by blood, but they were sort of like companies. You know, they were a company of people, and so every member of the company was kind of like a shareholder of the family, and in that sense, everybody was entitled to a share of the family wealth, and in that case, it was the land and the cattle. So one of the things that they had in Ireland that was we would consider socialistic, was what was called, the name is gone. They had the custom in England as well, parts of it called gavelkind, but essentially it was a redistribution of the land. I can't remember what it was called. It'll come back to me. So let's say within the family there's 100 acres. you had a right when you came of age and you were a young man and you were starting off in your life. A portion of that 100 acres was for you, and you got that, and you held it, and you could work it and turn a profit from it. You could make food
Yeah.
from it. You could have your cattle on it, but you never had true ownership of it, in the sense that you couldn't sell that land to somebody else outside of the tribe. You couldn't alienate the land from the tribe. And then as time went on, that land would be redistributed again into different parcels, because when the older members of the tribe died, um, and the new younger members of the tribe grew up a bit, they had to like divide it up again. So you would only hold on to it for maybe like 5 years or something, but you always would get a bit that was your social welfare, that was your social safety net, that you got to start off with something in life. You're guaranteed that you're going to get a bit of land and a bit of cattle, and at least, the very least, you could provide a sustenance for your family and take care of your family. But then, building on that, this is how it was socialist, but it wasn't. It was capitalist in the sense that you were prized in your family if you were one of the ingenious ones who could go and turn that wealth into greater wealth, and who could increase the value of the total stock of the family, the value of the shares of the family unit. And so there's a phrase in early Irish which is fair the chuinint, which means the man is better than his birth. And what implied by that, it's kind of like all men are created equally, but it kind of hints at that idea of what that means. But it was more than that. It was, first of all, that you were not to be held back by virtue of your birth. So it wasn't a caste system as what they had in India, where you're born into a certain caste, that's your caste, and there's nothing you can do to change it. But it was more built into that phrase, is fair for the chuinint, was the sort of like implied social expectation on you to go out and be entrepreneurial, go out and be innovative, go out and, increase your wealth. And we know for a fact that it wasn't socialistic, because it wasn't an egalitarian society. And this is something sometimes people have a problem with, that because the word egalitarian, it sounds great, and there's a lot of circumstances where to be egalitarian is right, but they valued value. And when you started off, or let's say the lowest rung of the free society, and I should say first that these people were called free men, right? The Fenechus is another name for the Shancus Mór, the book of the law, meant the law of the free land tillers. And that was like the common law. It was the law of the common man, but the common free man, right? Because there was a different law for the nobles called the Brehon Law, which was the judgments of the nobles. There was judgments that related to clergy. There was judgments that related to the poetics. Every sort of guild and industry had its own way of doing things, and there were certain books that were to instruct how you should treat people within that guild. And every single industry within it had its own like hierarchy. So obviously the poet of 20 years and who had been a poet to the king was of a higher status by virtue of the fact that he was of a higher status than the new guy who was just learning for a few years. There was a hierarchy of comb makers. There was a hierarchy of princes. There was a hierarchy even of the kings, and this is why we call it the High King. Below the High King, you had the 5 provincial kings, because Ireland used to have 5 provinces. Below the 5 provincial kings, you had the king of a Tuamore, which was a big Tua, which is kind of like a, what's the word, how would we say it today in the business world, like a merger and acquisition, where some smaller Tuas get together and they form into a bigger Tua, still keeping in mind this idea of the company. They're joining their wealth and their skills and their resources together to add increased value to the overall stock of the unit, which was made up of the individuals. Below the Tuamore, you had the groups that had joined into the Tuamore. So you had the chieftain of a Tua, and then you keep going down, you had the chieftain of the clan, the elected, and that was the big clan, the whole of the Flanagans, let's say. And then you had the chieftain of the household, ultimately, like which was the father in the Gelfina, depending what the makeup of the society. So in this sense, like it's us to imagine it, because we are so we have been, our political system and our education It's really hard for society without the dichotomy of the left and the right. It didn't exist. So I had aspects of both. Yes, you were absolutely prized, and it was like you literally raised your status and your honor prize in society when you gathered more wealth, and you became after you had the Kayla, which was a free farmer with no land. Then you had like there was two types of Kayla, Ser and Dare. Ser is the Irish word for free. So you had a Ser Kayla, and just below them you had a Dare Kayla, which is bonded. That didn't mean they were a slave. That means that they owed something to somebody. So they went to the guy down the road who had more money. So you're the big wealthy farmer, and you have hundreds of cattle and loads of land. And I have my little bit that I can grow my food on. But I want to have more. So I come to you, and it was a sign of your nobility that you could afford to give. If you were a hoarder, you weren't considered noble. So this idea of the evil capitalists hoarding their money, it wouldn't have worked in early Ireland. Your status was defined by how much you could afford to give to others. So if I came to you and I said, hey, I'd love a bit of land and can I have some cattle, I would be borrowing it off you. It was a renter economy. And I would then in turn owe you some amount of produce from my cattle and from the land. So because I owed you that, by virtue of my status was literally I was bonded to you. And it wasn't like a slave relationship, it was like a mutual relationship, and there was a kind of a master-servant relationship in a noble sense. And you loved your master because they were helping you to get onto the next step of the ladder. But if you had enough wealth acquired, ingenuity, you got your loan, you paid it off, you have your still bit of land, you're now a Ser Kayla. You're a free, landless farmer. And over time, if you could acquire more wealth, more land, more property, eventually you could become, if you were lucky, a Bow Ara. And a bow is a cow in Ireland, and Ara is a chieftain. A Bow Ara was a cow chief. And even the word buchel, what do you think the word buchel means? It's a buchel. It's the one, like a young fella who looks after the cow. Buchel. And they have like the bully was the place where they used to bring the cows to graze. So it was all very like tied into our... It says it's having trouble playing the video. I don't know if you still have video there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we had the original cowboys in Ireland, literally. And so you become a Bow Ara. And then after the Bow Ara, you had like degrees of Bow Ara above that. That was evidenced by the visible wealth. I knew you were of a higher status because I could see how much you had. And you were giving it away to people so that they could raise themselves up as well. Eventually then you get to the noble classes, which were called the Nemed. And within that you've got various grades again. And from the Nemed, where the chieftain was selected, or the king was selected. And from those kings, the provincial kings. And from those kings, the high king. That was in an ideal situation. Obviously they were kicking the crap out of each other all the time.
Yeah, and that's what I want to sort of ask you. Like, what do you know around how normal social interactions and communications were going on? Like, you make it sound all this voluntary sort of cooperation and stuff like that, but I imagine that there was a lot of ways that you could stand on your neighbor's toe and get into arguments over, oh no, this is the rule. Like, when was the interaction of the Brehons apparent? When was there a ruling needing to happen? Because I can imagine it was quite common.
Yeah, so this is the thing with all history, not just Irish history, is that you never learn about the fisherman's wife down in Cork. Or you never learn about the peasant who was making the young poor peasant boy who was making the bread. There's no books and stories written of them. Like, all of history is usually the journal of the rulers, right, and the war makers and so on. And that was also the case in Ireland. But there was, as I understand it, it was kind of a shame. You were kind of ashamed if you had to bring someone to the law. Like, if it got so bad.
Now.
Well, there's a culture now of especially in America, but also in Ireland, like what do you call it? Like a culture of suing each other, you know?
Litigiousness.
Yeah, litigious culture, exactly. So some people are opportunistic now in our system, and they want to. I tripped on a banana. I'm gonna sue you, you know, whatever it is, or you looked at me funny in the post office, I'm going to sue you because it's defamation or whatever. You know, like people are opportunistic, but um, I. Pat Flannery talks about this in his YouTube videos about how it's like, oh, like if I was to take you to law, if I it would signify to the community and the families within that community that we were sort of like incapable of finding a resolution ourselves. And it would be remembered for generations. You know what? You know what it's like in Ireland, right? They were like, "Oh, you know him there? Like, I took him to the law. So he did 30 years ago," and they still go on about it. You know. Yeah. So I think that it wouldn't be too unfair to imagine that most cases they try to find amicable remedies themselves, and the mindset was incredibly different than ours. Like the idea of a handshake, for example. It meant something, and if you entered into a contract with someone and you shook their hand, and then you reneged on your contract after you shook hands, I'm simplifying it. There's a little bit more ceremony and steps that had to be taken. I have the Irish contract law book here. Steps that had to be taken in order for it to be considered a bona fide contract. But it was like reputation was always very close at hand. It was on the shoulder, and it wasn't just yours. It was your uncle, your aunties, your granddad, his cousin, his cousin's uncle, and you had the name of, and your names are interesting, actually, and we've talked about that before, like Duffy and Orr. Duffy meaning black and Orr meaning gold. Like, I want to get close to you. And actually, the Duffy would mean like the tribe of the people who had the dark hair. You know, like it was a distinct characteristic. Maybe Orr, I don't know why. It could be where you get the, but or it could be that you just had loads of gold. I don't know. Like there's different ways of approaching the Irish names, but you were a Duffy, and like you're bringing shame on the Duffy name, and there was a we haven't even got to the Brehon yet, but there's also this aspect of like social insurance. So social insurance, we could look at that in many different ways today. We can look at it from an economic point of view, a socialist or capitalist point of view, and social insurance being something that like in a sense could be social welfare, but it could also be like indemnity for wrongdoing, right? So if you committed a wrong or you hurt somebody, you were liable in the first degree, but your family was liable in the immediate second degree. They were almost treated as a single unit in the law for the purposes of law. The delafina.
Compensation.
Exactly. So if you couldn't afford to pay, your family was automatically liable to pay. And this was a legal system that lasted for hundreds of years. So we have to be able to assume, without a police force and without a enforcement mechanism, that there was a certain amount of will on behalf of those people that they wanted to do that they wanted to make amends. And you can imagine somebody like young fella in the family who's after causing trouble and getting a clip around the ear hole off the uncle is like, oh, you have to go and pay now for your carry on. Mm-hmm. And when you think about that, you start to understand. Think about Irish people today. You know what I mean? Yeah. You start to get a feeling for what makes us different. Like so in one sense, you had a social safety net for the victim, that there was always somebody who would be able to pay or who would pay for the wrongdoing against them. But you also had this deterrent, then an inbuilt social deterrent, which is that I don't want to go out into society and do something that my granny's going to be suffering for, or beat me with the wooden spoon over, right? Or something like that. So the times that we know of, like where things would go to a Brehon, first of all, there was, as I said, many grades of Brehon, right? And like maybe the ones that we hear stories of are more the ones that were closer to the king, you know, the kingly grade. But there was like a Brehon for the Tua. Like, who do we call on? I'll call on Flannery down there. He's always really good at sorting these things out. He's a very fair man now. Get Flannery down here now. And he'd be usually an older gentleman, and maybe he'd know about the families. He probably watched the two boys growing up, and he'd be able to go, all right, look, this is how it is, and try to find a remedy that both families were both people and families were happy with. There's a quote. See what happens when you ask me. I'll just open the door in my head. And it's like, there's a quote from Sir John Davies, and I hate even calling it. I don't like using titles of British nobility, but John Davies, who was a Sir of the Crown. He was something like the Inspector General or the Attorney General over Ireland at some point around the penal law times. I can't remember the exact time, but we're talking like maybe 1700, something like that. And he said, "There's no nation of people under the sun that loves justice better than the Irish, nor will they rest better satisfied with the execution thereof, even if it be against themselves, so that they too can have the protection of the law when upon just cause they desire it." So that implies, it's amazing, because he was against us. He was against this Irish system. He was a person who was instrumental in abolishing the Brehon Law, because he has also said things like, you can't have a law standing in place. You can't have a law that competes against the law of the monarch, the king, the crown. So he was that's the way he thought generally about law and justice. It was the law of the king, and the king is the divine right to rule. Yet still he had this really nice thing to say about early Irish society, which was, even if you were the defendant, and even if the ruling was against you, you felt that justice was done. You felt it was fair, because if you could empathize with the person and put yourself in their shoe, that's the judgment that you would want for yourself. And that's like alien to us, So on the socialist and capitalist thing, I think that's like pretty much all how deep I've gone with that idea.
Well, like, we talk about capitalism, but there was no capitalism back then, right? Capitalism is since the 16th, 17th century, right? Very new.
Yes. And we've talked about this a lot before. I have an issue with the word capitalism as a sort of as an ideal. So for me, capitalism is the consequence of freedom, right? It's like what happens when you don't have a centralized power dictating tariffs and trade regulations and everything like that. When people are left to their own devices, they will innovate, they will create, they will begin to trade. And that's what we call capitalism. I prefer to talk about free markets and free trade. They're much more approachable terms for me, because for me personally, if I say I am a capitalist, it implies that capital is my highest core value, right? That the point that should determine the outcome is how much money do you make, and that's not the case for me. Freedom is the core value. And capitalism is a product of freedom. But not always. Not always. Because Singapore is capitalist, and I don't think I'd like to live in Singapore. They've got very strict rules and everything. I know it's a beautiful country and everything like that, but I value freedom, and I wouldn't have a lot of freedom in Singapore, but I'd have a lot of capital, right? So I think it's a little bit they're not married together, the idea of freedom and capitalism. And for me, freedom is what's most important. And what they had,
I would say that they're more married together than if you were to pair it with socialism and compare, right?
Using this analogy of marriage, I would say that capitalism is the child of freedom. It's not the husband or the wife. It's like the offspring of a free society, rather than the progenitor of the free society. And this is why I'm using the example of Singapore.
Which is put in the chat there, tanistry. Is that the word you were looking for?
Oh wow, I see loads of comments there. Tanistry. No, but no, it wasn't. I can't remember what word it was now. No, it wasn't tanistry. It's called gavelkind in like Wales or something. But where Johnny's probably getting that from, it's interesting, because there was the case of tanistry. The case of tanistry, which was one of the longest cases to ever be in front of the Crown, and it was never resolved. Kent, gavelkind was in Kent, and it was a system of land tenure that was found in other countries, counties of southern England and Wales and Ireland. And I can't find the Irish word for it, and that's kind of a pain. But the reason why it's connected to tanistry, it's interesting, is because gavelkind was a custom that the case of tanistry is studied in many different disciplines, not just in like Irish history or the law, but it's also studied in anthropology in relation to the behaviors of a colonizer, or the behaviors of, like, when Rome goes to a new country and colonizes them, to what extent do they allow their own customs to exist, to continue? So you have this idea of, like, do you try to totally eradicate their customs and replace them with your own customs, or do you allow for certain customs to exist, and try to put your own culture in a different way, maybe the language, maybe the schools or whatever, but the customs still exist. Like marriage would be a good example. How do they do marriage? Should they do it like we do it, or should they continue to do it as they do? And why Gavelkind is connected to the case of tanistry is, under the English crown, they allowed the custom of Gavelkind to continue in Kent, right? And they didn't allow the similar custom to happen in Ireland. And there's a reason for this. And this is a very interesting subject area, the case of tanistry, because you start to get into the very early origins of the legal person. And why was the legal person so important? And title. What is a title, and who does it come from, and why is that important? Because how this case came about was there was a land dispute, I think it was in Cork, between somebody who was claiming inheritance rights through Brehon Law, and somebody who was claiming it through the English system of, I think it was primogeniture. So these were two competing claims to land, and one of them was a guy who inherited the land through marriage to his wife, who was Irish, and she was like the firstborn of the only daughter, firstborn of the father. It's a very complicated case, but he was saying, I'm claiming this land because I'm inheriting the title to it through the English system. And the other guy was saying, no, I am the tanist, so I get to inherit it through the custom of tanistry, which is the same as Gavelkind. Well, it was similar, the redistribution of the land and the claiming of the land in the Irish system. I'm claiming it under that right. And what a tanist was it means the second. So you had a Taoiseach, which was the chieftain, and all these other families kind of had a claim to the throne because it wasn't primogeniture, right? So everybody who was in the noble class kind of had a claim or could be named chieftain by the clan later on. So to avoid disputes, familial disputes, feuds, in the event of the death of a chieftain prematurely, the second in command, the successor, was always named while he was alive. So everybody knew who the second was going to be, and it was named while he was alive, rather than he died and then there's like a power struggle and all of this stuff. And the Tanist had some lands that would be assigned to them as part of the dignity of their title. So, that was part of the wealth. If you had the land, you could turn it into more wealth. You could grow crops. You could have cows, whatever. So it was like a payment kind of that was attached to the title, not to the man. Let's say to the role more than the man. And so there was a dispute then between these two claims. They went. It's an amazing story to think that a bunch of Brehons, and it wasn't even that late, like that long ago. It was like later on in this story of like the penal laws, around like the early times of the penal laws, let's say, after the 1600s. And they went over and they made their case at the King's Bench. I can't remember how long it lasted, but maybe I can look it up. It lasted for a very long time. It might even be the longest case in the history of the Crown Courts. And it was never resolved. It was never resolved in the courts. And the Brehons were going over and they were like making the case on behalf of the Irish guy, the person who was claiming to tanistry. It was in 1608. And I don't know how long the case lasted, but it was like a long case. And as I said, it was never does
the word tan have anything to do with black and tan?
No.
So tanistry, like there's no etymological connection there?
No, I don't think so. I don't know what the etymology of tanistry is, but it's tanishta, like we have today in Ireland. It's the tanishta. Yeah. So it's tanishta. It's not tan, but when you anglicize it, it becomes tanist. But the tan was the color of the uniform. That's where that came from. The black and the tan. It was they were wearing black and brown uniforms.
Right.
Um, but that's an interesting question. I wonder what the etymology of it is for tanist. Longest, yeah, it is. It's the longest running civil court case. No, I can't find it.
Adam's asking, is tanist where we get tarnished from?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The tanist, the tarnished is the second, and the Taoiseach means chieftain. Like our old leaders of our clans were called the Taoiseach, and it's also found in Scotland as Taoiseach, and in Manx as Tanishti. So yeah, that's where it comes from. And it's really kind of depressing when you see Ireland today and how it's governed, and it's governed under it's like British bimarcarial, two houses, Parliament, Senate, British courts, British pageantry, Lord Mayors, and all of this appointed by higher powers.
There's many ways to look at that, though. There's many ways to look at that. Like, to say that it's a bad thing, like, if you give people the choice at the start of their life in, say, the year 1900, and say to an Irish person, you can either speak Irish or you can speak English, which do you choose?
In the early 1900s?
Yeah.
Well, depends on what part of the country you're in. US Brit. No, seriously, because like if you just go back a little bit longer, people were getting shot and because they were speaking their language. And I think in retrospect, it's
horrendous.
It's easy for us in retrospect to say, "Isn't it great we speak English?" Yes, it is, but there was a huge cost for that. And why can't we speak both? I'm living in Ukraine. They have a very similar history to us. They had a imperialist oppressor. They had the and many forms. They had like the Federation, then they had the Red Army, then they had the Nazis, then they had communism. And they had famine. Like in the last century, people are still alive today who can remember when 7 million Ukrainians died, and they were like people were eating.
That's horrific.
But they still have their language and they still have their culture, and they even the fact that you weren't allowed to speak Ukrainian during that time, they managed to keep it. And there's a lot of countries like that. The sad thing with Ireland is it doesn't have to be an either or situation, but it became that, and we lost a lot. We lost a lot.
Well, there's still embers, right? There's still embers of
the
language dotted around the country, so it's not dead.
No, it's not. It's not.
It's not very well taught in schools.
My point was around like our system today is that how they try to borrow our terminologies, like the Dáil, right? And Dáil was the name of a gathering, like a king would assemble a Dáil, and all the chieftains and nobles would come together and they would announce the laws, and contracts would be formed, and marriages maybe would be formed, and things like that. Oireachtas as well. And to call them the Taoiseach, I don't want them to call him the Taoiseach. Call him the Prime Minister. Call him by his British name, because that's what they emulate, right? They don't emulate the ideals of what we've talked about here, or like earlier on, and generally in the Brehon Law. They don't emulate what it is to be. They're not my chieftain. You know what I mean? They're not my chieftain. Yeah. And then it goes even further than that when you look at the names of the political parties. So the ones that are in power now, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Greens. The Greens are the Greens. But Fianna Fáil is warriors of destiny. And, Fianna, na Fianna were the warriors of Fionn McCool and his Fianna. And it's a beautiful legend of Fionn McCool, because they were warrior poets. They weren't just going around chopping people's heads off and brutally they were like the defenders of the land and the people from a principle of justice, and the old idea of a noble warrior code. And you couldn't be in the Fianna unless you were a master poet, and you could play the harp, and you could compose poetry. So you had this mixing of the feminine and masculine archetype there in the Na Fianna, who we should they're part of our culture that we are rightly proud, can be rightly proud of, in the same way that the Greeks should be of Homer. And yet you have this Fianna Fáil, the Warriors of Destiny. The next one then, Fine Gael. So I said the Delafina, the Gelfina, Fine Gael. It's not Fianna, it's their different words, right? And a lot of people outside of Ireland, they're just confused by this. But Fine Gael is the family of the Irish, the family of the Gael. And we know that when they were started, it was by, what was his name? Oh, his name, I forget. Who went off to fight with Franco in the Spanish Civil War. He went to fight on this Franco side. He was a fascist, like.
Oh, Duffy, was it?
Yeah, you're right. It was Donald Duffy. Maybe one of your relatives. I don't know. See what I mean about like the family name, Rob? See what I mean about the family name, and like, you know, like, what are you gonna do about that? No, I'm joking. There's pictures of them doing fascist salutes, you know, and then they're gonna stand in the Dáil today and assume the titles of our nobility, right? Knowing that they're descended from a fascist party. And
I never looked into that, actually.
I know that Micheál Martin is Fianna Fáil, but it was Matty McGrath who was saying, like, this was like Nazi Germany, and they're like, take that back. How dare you say such a thing about Nazi Germany? It's like, but just
that was brilliant. Did you hear that?
All your parties, all your parties are we're supporting them. Do you know what I mean? Like, your party, the Fine Gael for sure was, and Fianna Fáil, there was a lot of Fianna Fáilers who had, like, sympathies. And of course, like, people didn't know what was going on at the time, like, how bad it was with the Holocaust. That wasn't known all throughout the whole war. But even after it was known, there was a lot of people who were still professing fascism.
Yeah.
And I'm talking a lot, but I'll say one last thing. Mussolini said it best, that fascism is the merger of state and corporate power.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, fascism is not wearing brown uniforms and like rounding up the Jews. That's not fascism. That's not, that was like a Holocaust. That was a genocide. That was a brutal thing that happened by a group of people called the Nazis who profess fascism. Doesn't mean it's always going to look like that. Actually, sometimes it just looks like the merger of state and corporate power. So it looks like the video worked this time. That's good. The test worked.
It's fascinating. O'Duffy was attracted to various fascist movements on the continent. He raised the Irish Brigade to fight for Franco during the Spanish Civil War as an act of Catholic solidarity, and was inspired by Mussolini's Italy to found the National Corporate Party. During the Second World War, he offered to Nazi Germany the prospect of raising the Irish Brigade to fight against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, but this was not taken up. O'Duffy was an active in multiple sporting bodies, including the GAA and the Irish Olympic Council. I never actually looked into him. That's hilarious.
Yeah. Is it? Is it hilarious?
Well, it is that I share the same name.
The same name as him, yeah.
Well,
There's probably not only one Duffy clan, because the word means something that's quite generic of darkness. Like, there's more than one Flanagan clan, as far as I know. I think there's at least two, maybe three, and it's very difficult. I found it very difficult to try and understand which clan I could be from, because there's no records, right? Why is that? Huh? Why is that? Maybe it looks like it looked like there was a big event in our history that got rid of a lot of records and evidence. Yeah. So
you'd wonder what was going on there, what was burned, because like apparently, you know, it's vague. Like you've done your best to sort of patch it all together and know a lot of what was happening in ancient Ireland, but there's obviously a reason that they didn't want Ireland and what was happening here to be known. And when you explain about the Brehon Law, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
It sounds very voluntaristic. Sounds fair. There's a deep element of every man is respected, and the law and the justice and the fairness of it. It sounds like obviously there was barbarism as well, because it's, you know, those were the times.
Yeah.
But if you look around the world, it's got an interesting sense of justice.
Well, it certainly wasn't. The legal system, if you can call it that, certainly was not even close to being as brutal as contemporary systems at the time, like even the fact that there wasn't a death penalty, that was like really unusual. But I think you're kind of scraping on something here, and you mentioned like when you were talking about O'Duffy about something about Catholic support Catholic people in Europe. You know, the invasion of Ireland, there was no Protestant church at first. There was no Church of England, so it wasn't strictly speaking a religious sectarian thing like what we frame the situation today. We think of Northern Ireland and the Republic. We think Catholics and Protestants and everybody around the world. They mightn't know the details of it, but they know that that's a thing. But for several hundred years, there was no Protestant church. And there was no King of Ireland, like English King of Ireland. He was the Lord of Ireland, and that was a different thing. Because title and status and where you get that title from actually means something. And it still does today. It still does to this day. But the story goes that the only ever English Pope was Pope Gregory, I think his name was. And I think it was Henry II. I think he was the first Lord of Ireland. I could be wrong on that, but you're talking around the 1100s, and he issued what's called the Papal Bull Laudabiliter, which was a papal document which gave permission to the servant of the Vatican, which was the King of England, to basically kind of bring the Gaelic Irish people under the umbrella of the Vatican. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One of them was that the Celtic Irish, the Irish Christian Church under Columba, because Rome fell and there was no Vatican at first, right? It took a while to establish itself, but meanwhile Irish Christianity flourished. And there was a time in history where those two churches were basically in competition for each other for which one would be the one that would be kind of the predominant one in the world, the Latin one or the Gaelic one. And this is whitewashed out of our history in school. But you can read it, like, and then there was, I think it was called the Synod of Whitby, where it was kind of like moves started to be made against the Gaelic Church, which was in a way it was quite more nature based. They had the female priests. This is where you're getting like a Saint Bridget sort of idea. Like there was no, obviously they're men and women and they're different, but they were held. Do you know what it was like? It was more like the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. The early Irish Church was more like the Eastern Orthodox Church, but it had a much better established tradition than Rome. It celebrated Easter at a different time of the year, like the guys here do in the Slavic countries. They celebrate Easter at the Orthodox time. Ireland used to do that. And I was actually talking about this the other night on that other call, but I think one of the things that threatened the church the most, the Vatican, was that the Irish did not take their titles of nobility from the Pope. That's really important because all the monarchs after the fall of Rome and then like the new nobility that came along, and they were like brutal families who got to the top and like became the royals, the Saxe-Coburgs, the Saxe-Coburgs are the descendants of, and all of that. Where did they get the divine right to rule from? Who gave them the divine right to rule? Like what? Who sanctioned their bloodthirst, and all the killing and all everything and their theft? It was the Vatican, because that was the only like moral person at the time, moral like institution that claimed the right to be able to do that. So when the Pope or the bishop, on behalf of the Pope, put the crown on the King of France's head, or the King of Norway's head, or whatever, Netherlands, whatever, that's where their divine right to rule came from. But where did the Irish divine right to rule? They didn't really think of it like that. But where did their kingship come from? It came from thousands of years old traditions since time immemorial, that on that stone and under that tree, the Duffys were always crowned, or the Flanagans were always crowned in this way, when they turned in three circles and they married to the land, and they were elected to the council of the eligible nobility. So they didn't need the Vatican to get their divine rights to rule. They didn't need to turn to that. And I think that there's probably a deeper study into that whole time in Irish history to try and help us to understand why would they do this? Why did this happen? And of course, one of the agreements when he became Lord of Ireland was that he would collect a penny from each household, each hearth in the country on behalf of the church. So he was going to be a tax collector on behalf of the church. Obviously, there's land here. Obviously, it's fertile. Obviously, there's gold. Obviously, there's like same shit, right? Same shit, different millennia. They wanted the money, and so that's on a very basic level that was going on. But there was cultural, religious, historical factors as well that meant that the Irish were seen as a kind of a threat to the emerging established order of Rome and continental Europe. What are you thinking?
Yeah, like you could go anywhere with that.
I know.
I think we've been talking for 50 minutes. Maybe let people go to bed.
Yeah,
we can talk to them again, sure.
They can go to bed. Yeah, but thanks for doing this. I just wanted to test it out, and then we went on an L ramble. But it's like one of those conversations at the end of it, you just kind of like, so how's that weather we're having?
It's lashing rain here. I don't know if you can hear that.
Looks nice and sunny in your grass. All right, thanks, man. Talk to you soon. I'm going to switch off the stream. Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.